Now, let's go to criticism. Anyone have any issues so far? Difficulties with criticism? Criticism is a unique one now, and you need to be uniquely careful of it, okay? Criticism requires you to look, for the most part, it requires people to look at individual documents in isolation. It should be the complete opposite of comparison. But as you saw, the comparison questions can sometimes be slightly out of sync, and they might get you to just look at one document. Criticism as well, it has come up a few years. Be prepared for this, where you actually have to compare the documents. They have asked questions like, which document do you think is more reliable? So you're critiquing, but you're critiquing both documents. Now, typically, it should be just critique one of them on their own, because the argument is that the comparison part is already covered under comparison, but that is not to say that they can't ask, and they have. So be prepared for the possibility of them getting you to critique both documents at the same time, looking for example, which source, and this one has come up in the past, which source, document A or B, is more reliable. So then you have to deal with both documents in your 10-mark question, 5 marks each, and you have to come to a conclusion and a stated opinion that, you know, document A is more reliable. So be prepared for that. So would you agree that in document A, President Johnson is guilty of exaggeration? Give reasons for your answer. Now, exaggeration, we're looking for examples of exaggeration. So straight away, I have read the document again. Now is the time to be very careful of each document. So I give it a quick read again. I've already highlighted stuff on the first reading. And funnily enough, the stuff that I've circled, underlined, and highlighted is now going to help me quickly find the evidence I need for this question. So remember, in your first reading of each document, while you're dealing with comprehension, you want to really highlight interesting phrases, bits of exaggeration, hyperbole, foul language, anything that's out of the ordinary. Make sure you highlight them so you're simply not wasting time later on, and your eye can differentiate very quickly when you come to criticism. Okay? So I took the position that I agree with the assertion that Johnson is guilty of exaggeration in document A. So again, I'm taking this very structured approach. Firstly, Johnson uses hyperbole in his language, which undermines its accuracy and somewhat diminishes its value as a historical source. Now, I'm implying that this exaggeration is present, and if there is exaggeration present, then it undermines its usefulness as a historical source, which is not really what you're asked, but I'm leading on to something. He uses words like, quote, crucified and, quote, bitch of war to describe the false dilemma that he paints, choosing either social programs or a war abroad to exaggerate the difficulty of his decision. So what I'm saying is that he uses extreme language like crucified and bitch of a war to, you know, to gain sympathy from the reader, or to even moralize or justify to himself the false dilemma. And what false dilemma means is when people paint things into binary options. It's either yes or no, or black or white, war or peace. You can always have a third option. And the false dilemma is clear here. He uses exaggeration to back up and defend that, you know, false dilemma. And so the language that he uses is critically important here. And that's what you want to quote. Don't quote long sentences. Do not quote individual words and phrases. Far more accurate, and is guaranteed to get much more attention from the examiner. Secondly, he goes on to exaggerate the importance of the war on a global scale. So my point here, my second point here, is that he's exaggerating the importance of the entire war. He claims that there would be a direct correlation between being seen as, quote, an appeaser, itself a hyperbolic term. This idea again, that the false dilemma, that if you don't go to war, you're an appeaser. Now, it's a uniquely American way of looking at things, and it's brainwashing propaganda that you have to start a war, otherwise you're guilty of some huge moral weakness. Whereas a lot of the world would say any strategy or tactic to resolve issues without going to war is actually a sign of maturity. But it's very simplified sometimes in American society that if you avoid war, you're an appeaser. And not being able to accomplish anything for anybody anywhere on the entire globe. Now, that one you would take as a whole, because it is resplendent with hyperbole. You would not be able to accomplish anything. You couldn't accomplish anything anymore for anybody, no matter who it was, anywhere, in any context on the entire globe. It's absolutely class A1 exaggeration of example of exaggeration, because again, he's painting the false dilemma that if we don't commit to this now, we are finished as a country. We will mean nothing. Everyone will see us as cowards and appeasers. They will laugh at us. So it's a highly misleading document. Once you start to break it down, you begin to see that this is frantic with exaggeration. And it's not even the last one. This is clearly an exaggeration of the global importance of the war in Vietnam. So again, we want to keep going back to refer to the word in the question. Finally, he claims that this weakness itself, a very subjective way of looking at avoiding war. Why is that a weakness to avoid war? But anyway, he claims that this weakness would precipitate World War III, which is an extraordinary claim without any clear evidence. And with the power of hindsight, we can see it was absolute bumpkin. Of course, if, the idea that they fought in Vietnam, prevented World War III, it makes no sense. It absolutely makes no sense. If anything, fighting in Vietnam proved that the Americans could be beaten, could be resisted, and that they had divided opinions, and they had divided sense of action and purpose. So actually going to war in Vietnam was a huge mistake for America's standing in the world. As we'll see in the contextualization, it was a huge, huge mistake for their reputation and their standing. Okay. So it is resplendent with lots of exaggeration, and you'll note how I'm using it. Okay, I'm just fitting these quotes directly into my observations, and I've easily filled the 10 out of 10. Okay, now this one, expect this one to come up. What are the strengths and weaknesses of document B as a historical source? Now, by the way, that 20 relates to part A and B, just in case you're unclear. So 10 marks for this. Now, if it says strengths and weaknesses, do your best to find at least one weakness. Because if it says strengths and weaknesses, even if you were to list 14 strengths and no weaknesses, the question has explicitly stated weaknesses. So it's important that you find at least one. There is no necessity to find the same number of weaknesses as strengths. No, but you have to be seen to be treating the document fairly and in an unbiased manner, and you can always find a weakness if you look hard enough. Okay, because if you only mention strengths, the examiner then has no option and is not required to go any further than giving you 5 out of 10. No option. Okay, the examiners can only give you marks for what is written on the page. So if you only talk about strengths and you do not say anything about weaknesses, you're immediately down to 5 out of 10. So pay attention to the wording. So what I said is that document B has many strengths and weaknesses. Now, what's interesting about that phrasing, and useful too, by the way, is should you only give your opinion if the question explicitly asks for it? Yes, but let's be honest, Owen, your responses to all these questions are based, yes, on evidence. And the idea is to move away from opinion. The more evidence we use, the more credible our answers are. But still, it's our own perspective and our own reading. So our opinion, it's always our opinion, but the more it's based on fact, as in evidence from the documents, then it becomes more reliable. And that's it. There's no such thing as 100% verifiable, factual, unbiased observation, unless you're saying very simple things like, the earth revolves around the sun. There is no perspective in that. It is 100% factual, observable fact. Okay, so in other words, what I have done here is I have said there are many strengths and weaknesses. I didn't say there are many strengths and many weaknesses, and I didn't say that there are many weaknesses and strengths. I just said there are many strengths and weaknesses. So first in the exam, Deirdre, your question, yeah. I answered this the last night, and I'm going to take a few minutes here to answer this because this is important. For any of you who were with me last week, this question came up, and it's really, really important to have an idea or have a strategy before you go in. And the rationale that I went through, and the one that I always give to my students is, the document-based question, should it be done at the start or at the finish? When you think about it, if you're relying on your accuracy, your mental accuracy in examining documents, underlining, trying to find, precise words and phrases that represent bias, subjectivity, things like that, where do you think your mind would be sharper? At the start of a 2-hour 50 exam or at the end of it? Where do you think it would be sharper? The beginning, yes. And that's the question. Like, other people say, yeah, but the last essay is very difficult and I'm very tired by then. Well, the difference being, if you want, you could look at maybe one question in the other 3 sections and say, I have it all in my head, I'm going to start with this one. That's okay. But at the very least, the document question should go second. It's very important. Like a lot of my students will go straight to contextualization. Why? Because they are completely fresh. They're starting the exam and it requires memory. It's also the largest marks component of the document-based question. Now, others would argue that reading through and doing all the other sections first before contextualization sharpens the mind and brings back to the mind all the different facts and the different material that you need in order to answer that question. That's true too. But many of my students would go straight to the contextualization and they would start with that. They'd leave plenty of room after it. They'd be very careful to be very responsive to the contextualization question, which I'll go through now in a while. Why was President Johnson unable to win the war in Vietnam? And if they hit any kind of stagnation or break where they couldn't think of something to continue with, they would leave the 2 pages blank. They would set aside 2 pages for it, because generally your contextualization should be 1.5 pages, and they go straight to comprehension, then comparison, then criticism, and come back and finish the contextualization. Okay? So my answer is it should go first. And that's why it's placed as question 1, because your mind is sharper at the start and your mind is clear in terms of what the question is asking. Whereas the other essays in the other 3 sections, which we'll be doing over the next 8 weeks, we'll be doing them. I'll be doing different essays all the time. You're not required to be so precise and exactly refined in your language and your analysis. The contextualization requires you to be very precise in order to get as close as possible to 40 out of 40, okay? So I hope that answers your question. I would recommend heavily that you do it first, because if you've written 3 long essays and then you have to go to document question, you're exhausted. And mental exhaustion when examining things, it's not a good place to be. Okay? So straight away, I opened with this question, this statement. It has many strengths and weaknesses. I'm not clarifying how many strengths and how many weaknesses, but I'm answering the question straight away. Firstly, it has a visually impactful strength. So the first thing, it's a cartoon. So it visually impacts the reader. It clearly depicts the imbalance between the needs of military costs and spending with the needs for social welfare, health, and education. So as a cohesive whole, I'm identifying what the cartoon is trying to say. Okay? First, it's visually impactful, but then what is the visual impact meant to portray overall? And it's important to say what you think it's trying to say overall. So we've started very well. Secondly, the expression on LBJ's face, you'll notice that some of this is we used in previous answers, and that is perfectly okay if it's appropriate to the question asked. So the expression LBJ's face could be said to represent the reason for the disparity between spending on arms and military and health, education and welfare, as his face portrays a happy and contented expression. So the reason it has strength is, and I'm not saying, I'm not saying that this is exactly what LBJ wanted. I am saying that it is, as a historical source, it correctly portrays the attention Johnson gave to military issues and funding as opposed to health, education, and welfare issues. I'm not saying that's what he wanted. I'm saying that's what he did. And his presidency was defined by his complete obsession with the war in Vietnam. And he put all his strength, political power, and the economic might of the USA into winning that war. And he hugely ignored his own Great Society program. Okay? So in that sense, it's a strong characteristic of the document in that, as a historical source, it accurately portrays his level of attention. Okay. Thirdly, the real disparity of influence is visually emphasized in this cartoon between these competing ideologies and needs. So the very fact that the arms costs and the military establishments are depicted as huge adults, by the way, don't ever forget the guns. The guns are even huge, like they're oversized. The caricature of the oversized gun, even in relation to the huge, the 2 big men that are carrying it, the guns are way too big for them. And even that in itself, as part of the greater whole of the 2 large adults, really shows that the demands of arms costs and military establishments was overbearingly huge in comparison to the needs and demands of health, education, and welfare. So as a historical source, it's a great strength of this. I'm not saying it gives us all the information. I'm saying that the cartoon has great strength in that it depicts the demands of these 2 large ideologies, and they completely consumed Johnson's attention compared to demands of health, education, and welfare. Now I decided I'll try to find some weaknesses. And the weaknesses, of course, can be by addressing some aspects of the strengths. A significant weakness of this document as a historical source could be argued that it is far too simplistic. Now, that's an argument. It is largely representative and accurate, but is it too simplistic? As much as LBJ's reasoning in document A is very false dilemma, simplistic, black and white, a binary choice, this cartoon, which is clearly savagely criticizing Johnson, can be accused of being too simplistic as well. Another potential weakness is that of LBJ's contented, why did I spell that? Huh? Contented and happy expression. It could be argued that this is purely opinionated and does not take into account the real and difficult dilemma that he faced in balancing the needs of these competing ideologies or necessities. So that bit there is subjective. I don't think LBJ, having studied him a great deal over the years, and Robert McNamara and all the other hawks and doves in the American government, and knowing LBJ the way you and I now know him, I don't think he ever smiled a day in his life when he was in the White House. So we should draw to our attention what we do know, generally speaking, and him laughing and smiling, you know, it downplays the enormous obsessive damage that the Vietnam War did to his presidency. It destroyed him politically. So we know that this is actually a weakness of it. It's, again, it's extending from the original statement of the cartoon being too simplistic. And it's also accusing him of enjoying the fact that there was this huge imbalance between you know, military demands and social demands. And we can't say that for certain. We can speculate, and we can, you know, we can say that that's what we believe was the reality behind the scene. But unless we have evidence to it, we can't say it is a fact. Okay, so we can pinpoint that happy face as being, you know, misleading or a weakness. It can be color the impact of the cartoon as a historical source, and it can color it in a negative and unreliable way. Okay.